It's my great pleasure to be here today. Let me just acknowledge Prime Ministers, former Foreign Ministers, and particularly two Trade Ministers, former Trade Ministers we have here today, Philip Burden and Jim Sutton, subject very dear to your hearts, I'm sure, and ambassadors, distinguished guests, all. At the recent Otago Foreign Policy School, Vangelis Vitalis explored the risk posed by what's known as the Thucydides Trap, when a rising power causes fear in an established power, escalating toward war. In this case, today, we're not talking about the Peloponnesian Wars, but the jostling and resultant trade war currently being played out between the United States and China. There's an old African proverb, when the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers most. I don't think New Zealand is in that defeatist camp, and there'll be plenty of rich anecdotes that our panellists today will take you through, which leads to some optimism about our future. But there is an issue about what small states like New Zealand do when faced by major risks against a time of rising political uncertainty and also global economic uncertainty. It's also an environment where the retaliatory spiral of tariff increases are raising costs for consumers, damaging supply chains, forcing changes in production and investment decisions. And all this when it comes to a business environment which is being disrupted by e-commerce, the rise of blockchains, and it's a very complex environment. But if this golden weather that we have enjoyed in recent years is under challenge, are there some learnings we can take for our future? Our three panellists, Dr. Gary Hawke, Richard Nottage and Rob Scollay, are uniquely qualified to share their insights. Dr. Hawke's reflections will canvass New Zealand's strategic shift toward Asia, to embrace Asia and to become part of that rising economic miracle. Richard Nottage's case study will focus on the Uruguay round, which led to the establishment of the World Trade Organization and the rules-based order, which has served New Zealand's interests well. Rob Scollay will address the challenges that have arisen in the more immediate period, and also the need for bipartisanship. And as a comment of my own, as a long-time follower of negotiations like the TPP and subsequent CPTPP, it's been a pity to see the advent and rise of wedge politics, which really did lead to some untidiness, and hopefully that is a period that we can put behind us. And finally, Clare Kelly, our discussant, is deeply steeped in New Zealand's trade negotiations. She's currently Director of MFAT's Trade Negotiations Division, and she'll discuss New Zealand's response to this changing international context and put forward some new ideas which the Ministry and Government are developing to address the challenges. It's my hope that there might be time for comment, observation and questions from the floor, but judging by the last couple of sessions, we might be time press. So if that is the case, I do invite you to talk with our panellists during lunch. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce Gary Hawke. Gary, the floor is yours.
Tēnā koutou katoa. We're talking about the 75th anniversary, but the really interesting part of today's proceedings is extending what we have done in the past. There's some good histories of the early days of MFAT. There was a lot of material published on the 50th anniversary of MFAT, and so today I'm going to concentrate on the last 25 years. It's a period which the distinguished visiting Indian strategist and diplomat Shivshankar Menon recently described as the Age of Multilateralism. That's the experience of New Zealand too, and I think you'll see that the Age of Multilateralism has a bigger importance than might be immediately apparent. The essential context for New Zealand's trade and economic diplomacy in the last 25 years is the shift in emphasis towards Asia. The Uruguay round ended the annual procession of ministers to Europe, trade and agricultural ministers. It established some multilateral rules around agriculture. It was freed, our diplomacy was freed from the economic diplomacy, was freed from the insistent demands of Europe. There are even some early moves towards the incorporation of China in the course of the Uruguay rounds, which were not successful, but were picked up later, and China's entered the WTO in 2001. So when I say that the move to multilateralism was the characteristic of the last 25 years, in thinking of the inclusion of China as the major event of the last 15 years, and I am actually wondering whether the future of multilateralism is assured, or whether we are in fact looking at the 25 years of multilateralism. Recognition of the rise of China really began with observations of the relatively fast growth of the Asian tigers, led by Japan, and then followed by Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. And when we finally abandoned insulationism in the 1980s and sought our prosperity from participation in the international economy, we did in fact follow a strategy which had been pioneered in earlier years of diversification, looking for markets wherever they could be found, which naturally leads into an emphasis on multilateralism. But it was the relatively fast growth of China, the fast growth of the tigers and Japan and the tigers, which led us to emphasize Asia. This is all to be seen alongside the development of CER from 1983 and even more from the review of 1987-88, and we soon had FTAs with countries like Singapore and Chile, but the emphasis is very much on Asia within a continued concern with the global economy as a whole. When MFAT came to write in 1983, the trade strategy document, the emphasis was really very self-evident, that the emphasis should be on what we did domestically, what we did bilaterally, especially with Australia, what we did regionally, especially with APEC, and with what we did at a global level through the WTO. And that basic strategy has not changed a great deal in the last 25 years, and nor do I see it likely to change in the near future. The change which comes with the new document, Trade Agenda 2030, does not, in fact, look much change between New Zealand and overseas concerns. It concerns the mobilisation of support for the trade strategy within New Zealand. The public understanding and public support is what distinguishes that document from the earlier document of 1993. As I said, the driving force behind all this goes back well before the last 25 years. It goes back to concern about the constraint imposed by the relatively slow growth of the United Kingdom, and therefore the search for new markets, both through different products and through simply finding different markets. The emphasis, I would want to say, has always been on economic interdependence and even economic integration, and not on trade in any narrow sense. The arguments, therefore, have always led to the need to develop relationships with other countries, and the idea that we have been dominated by trade in the sense of really concern with tariffs has not, in fact, been appropriate. The agenda of international economic diplomacy has widened continuously from the start of the post-World War II moves within the GATT. You soon moved from tariffs to subsidies, you moved into government procurement, you moved into all of the areas which eventually became the agenda of the Uruguay round and the aborted agenda of the Doha round. It is simply a process of continually looking at what it is that prevents a flow of effective business relations between countries. And the argument is therefore about economic interdependence and integration, and not about trade in a narrow sense. It's worth remembering that in the early days of the GATT, when the emphasis was on binding tariffs, there were genuine arguments about whether it was possible for any government to bind its successors, and therefore was the notion of a bound tariff an immediate oxymoron. Well, for 50 years it looked as though that argument had not prevailed. It may be that President Trump has managed to revive it. MFAT, of course, has had to engage with all of these concerns throughout its history, and it is worth remembering the complexity of what's been involved in that. It's a matter of understanding different economies. It's a matter of understanding different products, and dairy products in 2018 are very different from the butter and cheese which we thought of as dairy products in 1965, or even the slightly wider range of dairy products which we thought about in 1990. So there are always increased demands of simply understanding what it is that we're talking about. But it's more than understanding the products, it's understanding the process. What the Asian tigers initially, and then Southeast Asia as a whole did, was introduce the process of economic integration in a different sense. It was a process which was business-led, a process which involved investment as much as the movement of goods and services across boundaries, and it meant essentially that fundamentally one had to stop thinking of the economic interrelations between economies in the terms of putting things in boxes and sending them off to grateful consumers in other countries, and really engaging in the process of production which would involve people in different economies at different times, and which would likely to involve networks rather than a bilateral relationship. And that too is something which has been a challenge to MFAT over the last 25 years. I would draw attention to the central position of ASEAN within this process. The importance was not just the markets of ASEAN, it was the way in which ASEAN was at the centre of the growth of international production networks, initially led by Japan, but is essentially becoming very much regionalised across the whole of the Pacific and throughout Asia. And one of the big successes of economic diplomacy in the last 25 years has been the way in which New Zealand has been able to insert itself into the Asia-Pacific architecture centred on ASEAN. There's only one area in which we didn't succeed in that, and it's the one that led to the Chiang Mai Initiative and eventually to AMRO, and it was a financial institution rather than one under the direct influence of ASEAN. Now, I've referred to the Asian integration process led by the Tigers. The final step that I want to really draw attention to, of course, is one which has occurred already in the discussion this morning, the rise of China. And the Chinese were too big to fit into the familiar image of the flying geese following Japanese leadership, and it really did change the nature of the regional economy, and eventually, of course, it is changing the nature of the international economy, and it is in fact imposing the biggest challenges, or the reactions to the rise of China, producing the greatest problems we have at the present day. But that's something which Rob will speak to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gary. It's now my pleasure to call on Richard Nottage to address us on the Uruguay round.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge three people in particular. My former boss of 9 years, Sir Don McKinnon, who's, now that I've got up to speak, is leaving. Russell Marshall, former Foreign Minister, also one of my bosses, and Jim Sutton, the Honourable Jim Sutton, former Trade Minister. But on this historic occasion, I want to make special thanks and gratitude to two other ministers. The first is the Right Honourable Mike Moore, and the second is the Honourable Philip Burden, who is now here and could well speak for himself, except he'd take too long. And the third one I'd like to acknowledge is Ted Woodfield, for many years the Deputy Secretary of Trade and Industry, for their 15-year contribution in launching, negotiating and concluding the Uruguay round. It was a major preoccupation of my career for many years, along with the other theme of this session, which Gary has talked about, which was the fundamental reorientation towards Asia in New Zealand's foreign and trade policy. Gary placed the Uruguay round in this wider setting, and he also mentioned that economic diplomacy depends on having appropriate political and personal relations that are built and sustained over time. And the Uruguay round is an outstanding example of this. The ministers concerned, from wherever they came from, got to know each other profoundly well, and they spent a lot of time fostering those relationships. There were similar relationships with all of the senior officials, the key senior officials, and it really was quite a remarkable thing. I think that personal relationships and these professional relationships were also there subsequently in the bilateral and plurilateral relationships that we subsequently negotiated. The Uruguay round, which many younger MFAT people will have never heard of and probably think belongs in the distant past, as I am from, it was the high watermark in multilateral trade negotiations, with the creation of the World Trade Organization and rules and disciplines across a whole array of trade topics. It was the largest, there were 126 countries involved, the longest, 1986 to 94, with 5 years before that intense negotiations to get the agenda right, and the most complex of multilateral negotiations with 15 negotiating groups, including agriculture for the first time. In my view, along with CER in 1983 and Protocol 18 of Britain's accession to the EEC, it was arguably, for New Zealand, the most successful trade negotiation result that we had achieved. And I'll explain that shortly. But first I want to give you, in the 10 minutes I've got, an insider's view of the politics involved in the formulation and negotiation of trade rules that underpin the WTO. And I'll restrict most of these comments to agriculture, because trade in agricultural products was, and it remains, the most protected sector in international trade and the most crucial for New Zealand. Discussions about preparations for a new GATT round began way back in 1981, and at that time the major countries, US, EEC, Japan, India, were not interested. And even worse, the US and the EEC were in a trade standoff over trade in agricultural products. And those who suffered most from this were not farmers in the US or the EEC, but those in third countries like New Zealand, Australia, Argentina, Brazil, and so on, who had to compete with subsidised products, undercutting world markets, and massive import restrictions. In attempts to try and unblock these logjams, various informal groups began to form, in all of which New Zealand was a member, and played a significant role at both ministerial and senior officials level. This informal group story is not one that's well known, and I won't go into all of them, but I'll just mention a few of them. In 1981, the GATT Director General put together a consultative group of 18, which was, in fact, the 18 most important countries in his view that might manage to get a new round going. New Zealand was part of it. The next group I'll mention is 1982, a group that became known as the Moors Group because it met in a small village outside Geneva. And this was the top 9 senior officials negotiating agriculture, not only from the US, the EC and so on, but New Zealand was a very prominent member in that throughout. It met twice a year, and it was gloves off, very frank negotiations amongst that group of countries. The third one was the informal trade ministers' meetings. These began in 1982, and Mike Moore played a very prominent part in them, as did Philip Burden subsequently. They were not by any means all the ministers involved in the WTO, but they were very crucial. And Mike Moore, in fact, hosted one of them in New Zealand, I remember very well, in Taupo in 1987. And then the final one I'll mention is in August 1986, which was the Cairns group of agricultural fair traders. That had its origins the month before in a meeting in Uruguay of New Zealand, Australia, Uruguay, Argentina and Brazil. And then subsequently, Mike Moore and his Australian counterpart had the meeting in Cairns, and to this day that is one of the crucial informal groups that operates in the multilateral system. In the final tense negotiations to launch the Uruguay round at Punta del Este, the US took a very hard-line position, and it called for the elimination of all export subsidies, which the EC, Japan, Korea and other protectionists totally rejected. And the Cairns group became the third force in this whole exercise. There were many other informal groups of countries meeting throughout the Uruguay round in various hotels and villages in and around Geneva. And New Zealand played a constructive part in many, many of them. Second, I'd just like to say very briefly the successful outcome to New Zealand. Prior to the creation of the WTO, New Zealand had no certainty or security of market access for our dairy products, sheep meat, beef, fruit, etc. For 30 years, ministers of trade and of agriculture trudged annually to Brussels and EU capitals, shoring up access. The Uruguay round brought agriculture fully into the multilateral trade system for the first time since 1948. And it gave us, for the first time, findings on greater access, not just with the EU, but with the other 126 member countries. But one other thing that I'll finish on is it greatly strengthened the dispute settlement process under the WTO. It was a major improvement to multilateral trade rules. And the vast majority of cases that New Zealand has taken to the WTO concerned agriculture, and all of them that we've taken in the years that followed, we have won. New Zealand, this is something that I think is quite remarkable. New Zealand has a unique record in serving on WTO dispute settlement panels. Chris Beebe was appointed one of the 7 inaugural appellate body members. Since the formation of the WTO, there have been 230 panels where countries have been trying to resolve their differences. New Zealanders have served on 60 of those. That's 1 in 4. And this is far the highest number of people serving on panels than any other of the 126 members of the WTO. Another very remarkable statistic is the succession of New Zealanders who have chaired crucial agricultural negotiations. Tim Grosser, Crawford Faulkner, David Walker, John Adank, and Vangelis Vitalis. And at the apex of it all, of course, Mike Moore, who was Director General of the WTO from 1999 to 2002. We often hear the phrase that New Zealand is a small country pulling above its weight in international affairs. Those are very concrete, striking examples. Finally, as others have done, I'd like to, and as Prime Minister Bolger and Helen Clark also mentioned, a word about the importance of political bipartisanship in international trade policy and negotiation. This was a very positive feature throughout the Uruguay round, but it became frayed over the TPP. In November 1990, the National Party won a landslide victory. And a month later, as Jim Bolger has said this morning, all 126 GATT members met in Brussels, allegedly to conclude the Uruguay round. The New Zealand delegation was led by Mr. Bolger, but it included, on the advice of the new Trade Minister, Philip Burden, the outgoing Prime Minister, Mike Moore, who had done so much to get the round underway and through its initial years. That meeting broke down, again over agriculture. Then, in April 1994, Philip Burden again invited Mike Moore to join us in Marrakesh for the final signing of the Uruguay round. And the last piece in this, in 1999, there was all-party support for our successful international campaign to have Mike Moore appointed Director General of the WTO. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I now invite Rob Scollay to take us into the challenges we face today.
Thank you, Fran. Good morning. Kia ora tātou. Challenges for the future. Where to start? Maybe a good place to begin is to contrast the future outlook as it looked 2 years ago, or as it looks today, with the outlook as it appeared just over 2 years ago when New Zealand found itself in something of a sweet spot in terms of its international trading relationships. At that time, things were looking pretty good for us. Having sidestepped the threat of exclusion from East Asian economic integration processes, New Zealand had firmly embedded itself in a developing Asia-Pacific architecture, which was to progress in orderly fashion through the completion of the RCEP and the TPP, eventual convergence on the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific. At that time, the subject of a collective strategic study in APEC, chaired, hard to believe today, chaired jointly by the United States and China. And a revitalised APEC had demonstrated its value as the designated incubator for the FTAAP as a venue for developing common understandings on a range of difficult but important issues such as trade and services and the design and implementation of trade and growth enhancing policy frameworks, and was looking forward to refreshing its mandate for the years beyond 2020. We heard about the Thucydides Trap today. For APEC developing economies, they're much more concerned about escaping the middle income trap, and China, of course, has to think about escaping from both traps simultaneously at the present time. Deepening of economic integration with Australia underway in its usual stop-start way, and relations with the EU had matured to the point where an EU-NZ FTA had begun to appear as a logical and feasible next step in the bilateral trade relationship. And most importantly, of course, the WTO. Despite the deep disappointment and frustration with its failure to make progress in the Doha round, the WTO continued to provide the rules-based multilateral trading system with the essential legal underpinnings and a reasonably effective process for resolving trade disputes. A notable, if belated, success had been the agreement to finally eliminate agricultural export subsidies reached at the 2015 Nairobi ministerial meeting. I suppose you could say better late than never. So how quickly things have changed. I mean, that's the whole outlook today is now completely different from that. New Zealand faces the most complex and difficult set of trade policy challenges it's faced, I think, for many years, and the future really looks quite unclear. Several, but by no means all of these challenges involve repercussions of the seemingly ever-escalating trade conflict between the two superpowers, the United States and China, which of course also happen to be two of our most important economic partners. And this conflict threatens to spill over into a number of dimensions of our trading relationships, so that navigating through this conflict, if it continues on its current path, is likely to be the biggest challenge facing New Zealand trade policy in coming years. In the Asia Pacific, the CPTPP now proceeds, of course, without the US. The RCEP moves slowly towards its conclusion, hopefully not too far away, but the intended endpoint of the process, from our point of view, the FTAAP, is receding further into the distance as a realistic prospect as the conflict deepens between its two most important prospective members. China's recently expressed interest in the possibility of joining the CPTPP, which in normal times would be viewed as a logical and positive development in the regional trade architecture, may fall foul of the poison pill. That's the words of US Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, the poison pill injected at the last minute into the recently completed USMCA, which we can call NAFTA Mark II. The poison pill has the stated intention of discouraging the deepening of trade relations or the formation of FTAs with China by Canada and Mexico, of course two key members of the CPTPP. Extension of this poison pill strategy to other proposed US FTAs, for example, the proposed FTAs with Japan and the UK, as has apparently been foreshadowed by the US, has the potential to further disrupt the evolution of Asia-Pacific trade relationships. An ambition to develop the CPTPP as a model of open plurilateralism, perhaps one of the most promising ways forward in the current circumstances, attracting a widening circle of members committed to a set of trade rules fit for the 21st century, may also be set back by this poison pill strategy. APEC's work programs, providing essential support for the development of common regional approaches to complex issues of economic integration, are at risk of being increasingly paralysed by the US-China disagreements, an unfortunate consequence that's going to be of particular concern for New Zealand, given that we have to host APEC in 2021, where we will have to manage the process. But of course, most alarming and most challenging are developments in the WTO, the foundation stone of New Zealand's trade interaction with the outside world, as we've heard. And although it's by no means the only cause of the organisation's trouble, the US-China conflict is at the heart of the conversion of what was previously a slow-burning decline of the organisation's effectiveness, think Doha Round, into an immediate existential threat to its viability, with the seeming sudden collapse of respect for the organisation's rules, admittedly imperfect and somewhat outdated as they are, and the impending forced cessation of the operation of the appellate body, effectively the end of the WTO's capacity to provide effective dispute resolution. I don't believe it's an exaggeration to say that the approach taken to all this by the WTO's largest member, with that approach we are being plunged back into the unilateralism of the 1980s, almost as if the WTO had never happened. We've heard how New Zealand ministers and trade officials have made many valuable contributions to the development and effective operation of the WTO, but they may be challenged as never before in contributing to the search for solutions to the current crisis in the WTO. Beyond the Asia-Pacific region, Brexit presents both defensive and positive challenges for New Zealand trade policy. The market access arrangements in the EU, so carefully and successfully constructed and solidified over many years, as we've just heard, will now have to be picked apart for redistribution between the UK and the EU. It's already clear that this will not be a simple or easy process. A more positive challenge from Brexit will be the opportunity to negotiate separate FTAs with the EU and the UK. Points of difference in the UK approach to FTAs as compared with the now well-established EU approach will probably become apparent and present their own particular challenges. An intriguing aspect of the challenge presented by an FTA negotiation with the UK is that the likely chief negotiator on the New Zealand, on the UK side, was formerly one of New Zealand's own most senior and most experienced trade negotiators. Well, we send them our rugby coaches to prepare sides to face the All Blacks. Why not trade negotiators? Mention of the EU invites reference to the many challenges of developing trade arrangements and trade rules for digital trade in the digital economy, a subject that a geriatric like me really is not qualified to talk about, so I won't, except to say that it is clearly one of the most important, if not the most important and most challenging area for trade policy of the future, and an area where the EU has been moving along a very distinctive path that has not always been enthusiastically received by its trading partners, to say the least. From our side, the CPTPP chapter on electronic commerce is often referenced as one of the most advanced, if not the most advanced, treatments of the issues in trade agreements to date, but it is very far from the last word on the subject. It provides a useful framework, but it leaves open many issues that will certainly need to be resolved in future agreements, a very significant challenge for our negotiators of the future and our trade policy thinkers of the future. As a final word, we've just heard, and heard several times this morning, about the strength that New Zealand has derived in the past in its trade endeavours from the bipartisan political consensus on trade policy. That consensus broke down during the TPP negotiations, but hopefully is in the process of being restored, and the severity of the challenges to be faced in the future makes this all the more important. And realistically, we have to recognise that it has also become more difficult in the wake of the so-called backlash against globalisation. We now understand clearly that while trade by itself should not be unfairly blamed for society's ills, the policy frameworks within which trade policy is embedded can have a decisive, or do have a decisive impact on how the effects of trade are spread across the community. And establishing a workable compatibility between the differing frameworks that inevitably exist within a healthy democracy is likely to be rather more difficult than establishing consensus on the trade policy itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob, and for Clare's response to this rather sobering context in which we find ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. Kia ora tātou. It's a great privilege to be here on behalf of the Ministry's Trade and Economic Group, and I too would like to acknowledge my many former bosses that are in the room today. In particular, two former directors of Trade Negotiations Division, Wade Armstrong and Derek Leask, who have been so integral to many of the successes that New Zealand has achieved in its trade policy during the last 25 years. Gary and Richard have very clearly outlined New Zealand's successful prosecution of its trade policy over the last 25 years, that has had at its heart the primacy of the multilateral rules-based system and the insertion of the New Zealand economy into the dynamic Asia-Pacific regional architecture. It was referred to, I think, as the Age of Multilateralism. My boss, Vangelis Vitalis, calls it the golden weather. And then Rob has outlined very clearly and compellingly that we seem to be coming to the end of the golden weather and entering into, instead, what we're calling turbulent times, and that this may remain our operating context for some years to come. This context is indeed challenging the three assumptions that have directed our trade policy since the formation of the World Trade Organization in particular. And those three assumptions have been that international trade would only ever continue in a more liberal direction, that the rules-based system underpinning global trade would continue to strengthen and expand, and that successive New Zealand governments could continue to rely on a wide base of domestic support for an ambitious liberalising trade policy. Our response as a ministry to that changing context is a mixture of continuity and new thinking. We're continuing to do what is tried and tested and what has worked so effectively in the past. We're defending, engaging, looking to strengthen the multilateral rules-based system, in particular the WTO. We're continuing to work in the way that's been so effective for us in that setting, by being interested, interesting, creative and constructive, by helping others with their own issues, by engaging and building strategic issues-based alliances. As the speakers have outlined, that has worked so successfully for us in the past, and so we're continuing with that successful set of tactics, particularly as we enter into a very intensive process of looking at the reform of the WTO's rulemaking systems and processes. We're continuing to embed New Zealand in the regional economic architecture, plurilaterally and bilaterally, in whatever format is most appropriate. We're entering into our negotiating agenda is more extensive than ever, and we have some new geographical partners, for example, the Pacific Alliance countries of Latin America. We're doubling down on supporting what we call regional and global public goods, and those are the institutions and processes that contribute so much of the strategic thinking in the international trade policy and rulemaking space. And the example of that comes to mind first is, of course, APEC, which has been so important to us. As Fran mentioned at the outset, we're also looking at some new thinking in terms of reacting to our context and operating effectively within it. We are advancing the idea of open plurilateralism, by which we mean flexible and open negotiating approaches to trade agreements, to regional and trade agreements, but also in the WTO context, as a way to support multilateralism. That always remains our goal, multilateral outcomes in the World Trade Organization. But we're promoting the idea of flexibility in the way we get to those outcomes. The WTO's framework allows for negotiations to advance in many different ways, and we're happy for small groups to form, for particular interests to be pressed, as long as at any time those groupings, formations, outcomes are open to other WTO members as they feel they're able to participate. In an operational sense, we're also intensifying our economic diplomacy, and I mean that in a slightly more narrow context than the one that Gary described. The Ministry has a very important role abroad as a facilitator for New Zealand companies in their markets, as a gatherer of market information, as a support to New Zealand exporters, and as a partner to all the NZ Inc. agencies, but in particular for NZ Trade and Enterprise in its work with New Zealand exporters. We think we do a good job of this, but we're really focusing on lifting our game in that regard and looking at ways to better utilise the enormous intellectual capacity that the Ministry can bring to companies' approaches to their markets, more directly to them in New Zealand. And then most importantly, what we've been working on in the Ministry for the last year is the development of a Trade for All agenda, which I hope you've all heard about. It is a response to exactly the issue that all the panellists identified, of that fraying of the social licence for the trade policy direction that we've pursued during the period of the golden weather. And the Trade for All agenda does a number of things. Most importantly, it's establishing a genuine and enduring conversation with New Zealanders about trade policy and about our trade rule making. And it is providing an opportunity to New Zealanders to have their say, to contribute, to raise the issues of concern to them around our trade policy. We are looking within that process to ensure that New Zealand's trade agreements and their outcomes are accessible to the widest possible range of New Zealanders. We want those outcomes to be to have a progressive and inclusive direction, and to benefit as wide a range of New Zealanders as possible, regardless of where they live, what they do. This process is ongoing. We are developing the agenda. At present, we have just finished the first part of the external outreach. The Ministry has held 15 public meetings and 11 hui around the country. We have just closed our Have Your Say website, our public submissions process, after 6 weeks. We're now in the process of collating and absorbing and synthesising all the inputs that we've received for on passing to ministers and to a Trade for All Advisory Board, which is going to study in detail the issues raised during the consultation and make recommendations to government to shape the future direction of our trade policy to ensure that it is progressive and inclusive, that it is trade for all, and that it supports the objectives that New Zealand has pursued successfully for the last 25 years. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a little bit of time for audience feedback and participation, but just briefly, I'd like to, while you're thinking of what those observations or questions might be, put a question to Gary, just picking up on Clare's comment. What kind of popular support is needed for successful economic diplomacy?
Thanks, Fran. Economic diplomacy can be complex. That's what makes it extremely interesting. It's also demanding, but it's always important eventually that somebody explains the outcome in terms which make it clear where the general welfare is actually increased. And so it is always worth going back to what are the fundamental arguments about economic interdependence. Tariffs and all other topics of modern economic diplomacy are about constraints on combining resources across borders. The maximum production of any region can be attained only by minimising the number of constraints on the way in which resources are combined. So the objective in removing constraints on total production is simply by removing the constraints on it. Now that's the core argument around economic interdependence, and there are obviously a lot of qualifications which can be made about it. Production, as I've used it there, means valued production. That means that you're already into the discussion of the values of particular communities within a region which one's looking at. And there's no way of avoiding negotiations and discussions to reconcile different views of what is allowed to be valued. And you're thinking about resources. And by resources, I mean all of the things which are used in producing things which contribute to general welfare of any sort. Resources, however, are not fixed. Resources change over time, and in particular, learning contributes to the recognition of new resources. And so you've always got to look at what are the processes by which the total resources of a region are being changed. And it's always particularly difficult if the learning takes place because you're doing something. That makes it worthwhile to do something, even though it may not be a sensible use of resources immediately. It can become so over time. That's, in fact, the most challenging exception to the notion that removing constraints is desirable, and it's the one which needs the most stringent examination, because it's very easy to invent an argument that says, what I'm doing now wastes resources, but give me 50 years and it'll be to your benefit to allow me to continue doing what I want to do. And finally, and one that comes closest to things which Clare has just been talking about, removing constraints guarantees maximum production for the region as a whole. It doesn't guarantee a gain in output or welfare for any particular part of the region or for any particular group within any particular region. So there's never a possibility of substituting a simple formula for trade policy. It is always a process of dealing in the terms of public management with finding a way of providing a transitional path for those who are adversely affected by any development. And that's the sort of core about public policy. Now that is taking advantage of David's invitation right at the beginning to talk about the contribution of academics to the discussion. You're going to have some difficulty explaining that to a public audience, but that's the job of the diplomats. That is in fact what is required to mobilise secure public support for trade policy. And the way to do it is obviously to take any of the standard rhetorical arguments, which are mostly self-interest dressed up as claiming public interest, is to insist that they be related back to the core arguments about the advantages of economic integration, and to conduct the debate along those terms. It's also the only sensible way of looking at the new issues which Rob referred to.
Yeah. And at this point, I think I might bring Rob in because we're on very short time.
Let me just make that the last point. E-commerce, there are chapters about e-commerce, but the e-commerce will be part of trade diplomacy when e-commerce is spread throughout the whole process. If the whole of economic interdependence now takes place in a world of electronic communication, it's not something which is added on to traditional questions.
I'd just like to add 2 sentences to what Gary has said, the importance of understanding the economics of international trade and relate that to the challenge we're facing, challenges I talked about. One of the things that makes the current challenges so difficult and so difficult to reach any kind of intelligent resolution of it is that the trade policy being pursued by one of the major players in this whole situation is frankly based on a fundamentally mistaken understanding of the economics of international trade, and that makes it really, really difficult.
Okay, look, there is time for a couple of observations or questions from the floor. Do we have one up there? Yeah, thank you. If you just identify yourself.
Is that working?
Yes, I think.
Okay. Adding on to that discussion, and it's a question really of whose responsibility is what here. I don't see that it's fair to say to the trade negotiators that they've got to manage the distribution of benefits from trade. You can never negotiate a trade agreement that will benefit everybody equally across the economy. You negotiate one which benefits the economy as a whole. And then it's the job of somebody else, like Treasury, social welfare, whoever is responsible for the distribution issues within the country to make sure that you get the general benefit and that people understand what's going on. Aren't we asking too much of MFAT to take responsibility for all that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and that's why I said that the important thing about how the benefit or the impacts of trade are spread across the community is not trade policy in itself, it's the overall economic policy framework within which trade policy is embedded. And governments, each government has the responsibility for that. It's not the responsibility of the trade negotiators. And if you look back into recent economic history, you can find numerous episodes where trade liberalisation or international financial liberalisation has been pursued in isolation from attention to the overall domestic economic policy framework, and in most cases they turn out to be disasters. So absolutely, you do have to think about the framework, the policy framework within which all this takes place, but that's a responsibility of each national government.
If I could just invite perhaps Jim Sutton to reflect briefly on, you will recall, Jim, the Trade Liberalisation Network, which came into effect about the time you had to convince a caucus of the desirability of pressing forward with FTAs with China and elsewhere, which were quite challenging. And I wonder if you might have an insight of how you actually created that coalition of interest.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Fran.
Sorry, I didn't warn you.
But I agree. I mean, the difficulty is persuading the people who vote to give the elected politicians the power to pursue a trade policy, is persuade them that it'll be good for them. And one of the things we did, and I don't want to claim any personal kudos or anything, because I had a great mentor in John Wood, Dr. John Wood, when I unexpectedly became Minister for Trade Negotiation, completely out of the blue as far as I was concerned, and totally unqualified, never been on the relevant committees. Never mind. I did pick up a few things, and one of these is you've got to know what your counterparty really wants out of it, what's good for them. And to me, the clearest thing, and I was fortunate in my life to have had some contact with China before I got sort of political responsibilities, to realise what an important thing it is for China to have food security. And given that they had 21% of the world's population and 7% of the arable soils, they weren't going to be self-sufficient. So I think that it is about putting yourself in others' shoes. And I thought that quote from the man previously about, oh, what a gift it is to see ourselves as others see us. Something has to be emblazoned over every office doorway in MFAT.
Thanks for that contribution, Jim. Just to the panel, more open question about dealing with our relations, economic relations with both China and also the United States during this period. Also against a background where some of our economic partners, particularly the United States and Australia, are questioning the extent of foreign influence by China on our political systems. I mean, this seems from the outside to be quite fraught, and I wonder if there's some observations from the panel about how New Zealand, either at the diplomatic level or political level, should find their way through this period. Who would like to go first?
Well, I'm probably not right up to date with it, but I think when multilateral institutions and systems are under the great threat that they are now, one of the things that has to be done if you're going to make progress is for countries and groups of countries to get together and start to try and work out what needs to be done. And I'm not sure what is going on these days in the WTO, but there's a real need to come to grips with some of the things that are at the heart of this US-China issue, and it's not simply those two alone. I think that the policies of non-market economies and so on, and how that all fits into the multilateral rules is one area. Another problem with the WTO is the unanimity or consensus rule. Every single decision has to be consensus. And that gives all 167 now members a veto. So that's a great difficulty. And I think there are others that are coming up. There's the whole question of the graduation of developing countries and so on. But probably Clare knows more than I do. But I think, as I was saying in my short address, that there is a real need for like-minded countries to get together to try to find their way through this, to find solutions and constructive solutions. You don't go about bringing the whole house down in seeking the improvement of the WTO. You've got to try to find your way to constructive solutions. And I think there is a role for a whole group of countries and different groups to really get after it.
Any further questions from the floor? Comments, observations?
I found that
I
found that a very depressing, listening to the panel, very depressing business. We all know that the WTO was having difficulties long before the Americans decided to try to upset the whole of the body and the dispute settlement system. I'd just like to raise a point and perhaps a question to Clare and to Richard Nottage. Right at the moment, the headlines in part are dominated by Brexit. It's interesting to reflect that the EU has, I think, something like 80 agreements on specific tariff arrangements, including with New Zealand on some key commodities for us. But among the others who are signed up to those arrangements are the US. Now, some of those arrangements, it depends on what the EU and the United Kingdom negotiate may be contentious. They may even require third parties to go to dispute settlement. I think it would be, of course, ironic if the United States found itself in the position of having shot itself in the foot. And I would like to ask whether the United States is in fact participating in the process of looking at reform of the WTO in a way that brings plurilateralism to the fore, as you've mentioned, and reforms the legal system. Thank you.
On the first comment or observation that was made about MFAT's responsibilities, redistribution of economic benefit is of course not within our responsibility, but trade policy and trade rule making is. So it is contingent upon us to have conversations about that and to listen to what exporters and others find of concern and interest in that regard. And especially when we have, as we do at the moment, such an extensive negotiating agenda, including with very significant partners such as the European Union, this presents a particular opportunity to look at state-of-art disciplines, obligations, processes that can be established that take our trade policy in a direction that is as progressive and inclusive as possible, particularly with a partner like the European Union that has very similar objectives. On the issue of WTO reform, yes, we're finding out we're really having to work in very specific issues-based groups, as Richard has noted. For example, Minister Parker will go to Canada next week, to Ottawa, to a meeting of 13 countries, of which New Zealand is one, a mixture of some very big players and some small, influential WTO stalwarts such as New Zealand and Singapore and Chile, Mexico also. We put a lot of effort and we put a lot of optimism around our participation in those processes and that kind of conversation. We think that's where we'll come up with the kind of thinking that will advance the problems or get us through the problems that we're having at the moment. And Wade raised a very important point. The US's concerns about the appellate body in particular well predate the current government, though the current government has been very effective in making those the concern of the entire WTO. So that's the new situation that we're in. Is the US engaged? It is, of course, engaging in its own way. And I think has very usefully in the last couple of days been extremely clear about many of the concerns that it has. There is a podcast, I'm afraid I don't know where to find it, probably if you Googled US Ambassador Shea WTO reform, that 60-minute speech setting out very clearly the US's specific concerns and having that kind of very frank iteration of US thinking is incredibly useful because it does help us engage to separate what can be done and perhaps what can't and engage on that basis. So I think more than ever, New Zealand has always been a country that in the WTO context and other contexts, we form small groups, we advance issues, we do other countries' thinking, sometimes for them or along with them, even on issues that don't really matter to us in order to advance our own. So I think there's a real role for us at the moment because having had so much experience in that space, we're in a good position to contribute now at a really critical time for international rulemaking in the trade space.
And on that optimistic note, where we are hearing from Clare about how MFAT is perhaps reaching back into the kind of strengths and expertise that it had at the time of the Uruguay round and the establishment of the WTO, that role of the small nation through this turbulent time. I mean, it's terrific, frankly, to hear just what MFAT's doing. I'd like to thank the panel, which has traversed the history, the challenges of getting the WTO established, and obviously the turbulent times we face now. We could talk all day on this, but thank you very much for the rich insights.